It is March of 845 AD. Stand on the banks of the Seine River outside Paris and look west. What you see coming toward you out of the gray morning mist will be the last thing many people in this city ever see. 120 Viking longships, moving in perfect formation up the river, each one a masterpiece of Scandinavian engineering, low, fast, virtually silent, capable of navigating both open ocean and shallow river with equal terrifying ease. Each one packed with warriors hardened by years of raiding, killing, and surviving in the most brutal conditions the northern world could produce. At their head, a man whose name alone was enough to empty a village, Ragnar Lothbrok, chieftain. Raider, commander of the most audacious Viking assault ever launched against the heart of the Frankish Empire. Paris in 845 was not a small provincial town. It was a significant and symbolically important city, the jewel of the Carolingian Empire, the civilization that had risen from the wreckage of Rome to dominate Western Europe. Charles the Bald, grandson of the great Charlemagne himself, ruled from here. And on this cold March morning, every claim the Frankish Empire made to power, civilization, and military strength was about to be tested. It was about to fail spectacularly. Before we follow those ships up the Seine, we need to understand the man commanding them. Ragnar Lothbrok is one of the most disputed figures in Viking history, a man who exists simultaneously in the historical record and in the realm of legend, the two so thoroughly intertwined that separating them is almost impossible. What we know with reasonable certainty is this: he was a Scandinavian chieftain of extraordinary military ability and even more extraordinary ambition. He had already raided extensively across England and Francia before turning his attention to Paris. He understood something that most raiders of his era did not, that the greatest prizes were not found in small coastal monasteries, but in the wealthy, symbolically important cities that formed the beating hearts of the kingdoms he intended to terrify. Paris was not a random target, it was a calculated one, a statement. By striking at Paris, at the very center of Carolingian power, Ragnar was sending a message to every king in Europe. No city was safe, no river was a barrier. No wall was high enough, no army was large enough to stop what was coming down from the north. The historical sources that mention him are frustratingly incomplete. Frankish chronicles record the raid with the tight-lipped shame of men writing about their own humiliation. The Norse sagas that celebrate him were written centuries later and blend history with mythology as freely as water blends with wine. But the raid itself, the 120 ships, the Seine, the silver that is documented. That happened, and it changed Europe. To understand how Paris fell to Ragnar's wolves, you need to understand the state of the Frankish Empire in 845. On paper, it was still the most powerful political entity in Western Europe. The legacy of Charlemagne, the great emperor who had united most of Western Europe under a single Christian crown just decades before, still gave the Carolingian dynasty an aura of invincibility. But auras are not armies, and the Carolingian Empire of 845 was a hollow version of what Charlemagne had built. After Charlemagne's death in 814, his empire had been divided among his sons, and then divided again, and then fought over in a series of civil wars that had drained its military strength, exhausted its treasury, and fatally undermined the loyalty networks that held the feudal system together. Charles the Bald, king of West Francia, the portion of the empire that included Paris, was a man ruling a kingdom that was already coming apart at the seams. He faced not only Viking raids from the north and west, but rival Frankish nobles who were more interested in their own power than in defending the realm. His military resources were stretched impossibly thin. His ability to respond rapidly to threats was severely compromised by the political fractures running through his kingdom. When Ragnar's fleet appeared on the Seine, Charles was not facing this crisis from a position of strength. He was facing it from a position of desperate fragility, and Ragnar knew it. Ragnar did not sail straight to Paris and demand surrender. He was too smart for that, too experienced. He understood that terror, properly applied before the main assault, was worth more than 1,000 additional warriors. And so the Viking fleet worked its way up the Seine methodically, like a predator that knows its prey is already cornered and sees no reason to hurry. Villages on the Seine's banks were raided and burned. Churches were targeted specifically, not merely for their treasures, though those were taken with enthusiasm, but because burning a church sent a message that went beyond mere military threat. It struck at the spiritual heart of a Christian civilization. It said, "Your God cannot protect you here. Your civilization's most sacred spaces are ours to destroy. Monasteries that had stood for generations were reduced to ash and rubble in hours. The monks who had not fled in time faced a choice between death and enslavement. Many chose neither fast enough. The psychological impact on the Frankish population was devastating. Refugees flooded toward Paris carrying stories of what was coming behind them, stories of longships appearing from nowhere, of warriors who seemed to feel no fear and no mercy, of fire consuming everything that could not be moved fast enough. Charles attempted to divide his forces and intercept the Vikings on both banks of the Seine simultaneously, a strategy that might have worked against a conventional enemy, but against Ragnar's experienced fleet served only to divide his already inadequate forces into two even more inadequate halves. Ragnar struck one of these divided forces first, defeated it completely, and hanged 111 Frankish prisoners on an island in the Seine in full view of the other Frankish force on the opposite bank. As both a sacrifice to Odin and a message, the message was received. The fleet reached Paris on Easter Sunday, March 28, 845. The choice of date was almost certainly deliberate. Ragnar knew that Easter was the most sacred day in the Christian calendar, and arriving on that day to sack a Christian city was a statement of contempt so pointed it needed no translation. Paris in 845 was centered on the Isle de la Cité, the island in the middle of the Seine, connected to both banks by bridges that formed its primary defensive barriers. The Vikings moved through the city with terrifying efficiency. Churches burned. The population that had not fled huddled behind whatever walls they could find. The smell of smoke and fear hung over everything. And through it all, Charles the Bald sat with what remained of his forces, watching from a distance, unable or unwilling to mount the kind of direct military confrontation that might have saved his city's honor even if it could not save its buildings. Contemporary Frankish chronicles describe the scene with the barely contained shame of men forced to record their own civilization's humiliation in real time. The greatest city in the Frankish Empire, the jewel of Carolingian power, the legacy of Charlemagne burning. And the man responsible for its defense sitting at a safe distance, counting the silver he would need to make this nightmare end. And then came the moment that would echo through history as one of the most humiliating episodes in the story of medieval European kingship. Charles the Bald, king of West Francia, heir to the legacy of Charlemagne, ruler of what was supposed to be the most powerful Christian kingdom in Europe, opened negotiations with Ragnar Lothbrok. Not from a position of military strength, not after a successful counterattack that had given him leverage, but from a position of complete and total military impotence. His city was burning, his army was broken and demoralized. His soldiers had watched 111 of their comrades hanged in plain sight and had been powerless to intervene. And Ragnar, camped comfortably in the ruins of what he had already taken, simply waited. The terms that emerged from these negotiations were as stark as they were simple. Charles would pay 7,000 pounds of silver. In exchange, Ragnar and his fleet would leave Paris and return north. 7,000 pounds of silver. The equivalent in modern terms of a sum that would make a significant nation-state flinch, paid not as the result of a treaty between equals, paid as tribute, as ransom. As the price of ending an occupation that Charles had proved incapable of ending by force. The silver was gathered from the churches, the monasteries, the treasuries of the Frankish realm, much of it the very treasure that the Vikings had not yet taken directly. And when it was handed over and the longships turned north and disappeared back down the Seine, Paris was left standing. Technically, but something more important than buildings had been destroyed. The myth of Carolingian invincibility was gone. And every Viking chieftain in Scandinavia received the news with the same thought forming behind their eyes. If Paris could be ransomed, what could not? The Vikings left Paris in 845, but they never truly left Europe. What Ragnar's raid had demonstrated, with brutal and irrefutable clarity, was that the great kingdoms of Western Europe were vulnerable in ways their rulers had refused to acknowledge and their populations had never imagined. The ransom paid to Ragnar became the template for what the Franks called Danegeld, payments made to Viking raiders to persuade them to go away rather than destroy everything. It was a policy that worked in the short term and failed catastrophically in the long term, because the news of Ragnar's 7,000 pounds of silver spread across Scandinavia like wildfire. Within years, Viking raids on Francia intensified dramatically. Paris itself would be besieged again, most famously in 885 to 886 AD, when a Viking force even larger than Ragnar's returned to find a city that had learned from its shame, and this time fought back with everything it had. The 845 raid also accelerated profound changes in European political and military organization. The feudal system that would define medieval Europe for centuries was shaped in significant part by the need to organize local defense against Viking raids that no central authority seemed capable of stopping. Ragnar Lothbrok's 120 ships did not just terrorize Paris for a few weeks in the spring of 845. They helped reshape the political architecture of an entire continent. History's most consequential events are rarely the ones that feel most dramatic in the moment. They are the ones whose shadows stretch the furthest. And there it is, 120 ships, 7,000 pounds of silver, and a lesson that Europe's greatest kingdom learned the hardest possible way, that walls mean nothing without the will to defend them. That wealth means nothing without the strength to protect it, and that the most dangerous enemy is always the one that everyone assumed could never reach this far. Paris survived 845. It was besieged again 40 years later and fought back with everything it had learned from its shame. History has a way of turning humiliation into determination if the people who lived through it chose to learn rather than simply to forget. If this story gripped you, please hit that like button and subscribe. It keeps these stories alive every single week. And now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what history subject are you most curious about? A forgotten battle, a legendary figure, a moment that changed everything? Write it below, because our next video might be your idea brought to life. Hit the notification bell so you never miss the next story. Until then, stay curious. The most extraordinary chapters of history are always the ones hiding just beneath the surface.